My name is Rabta Nije Paley. I am a Liberian academic, activist, and author. Well, I think diasporas really sit in a hybrid space. They understand local context because they're from countries, origin countries. They're also in host countries, and they understand transnational or international context as well. And so they bring a certain level of perspective that the local context doesn't necessarily have, or the so-called international context doesn't necessarily have. We hear a lot about remittances. So you'll see in the development discourse, remittances surpass overseas development assistance in the billions we're talking about. Remittances also enable households to survive in very dire and difficult circumstances. They're also, beyond the monetary transfers, there's also social remittances, transferring skills that diasporas bring as returnees, but also as diasporas who live in host countries. Many diasporas come back to post-conflict or post-war context to work in governments. They come to work in the private sector. They come to work in the NGO or humanitarian sector. So there are different layers in which diasporas contribute to home country development, but then also host country development, right? They're building the infrastructure, the economies of the countries in which they live, through their work, through their entrepreneurial capacities, through their ability, again, to link the host land with the homeland. Many of them come back and bring their skills, so they're doctors and lawyers and engineers and geologists who come back and serve in that way. So the remittances are social, political, and economic capital. Many of them are very, very engaged in lobbying international or host land governments to either intervene in crisis or conflict situations. Many of them are involved in rallying around political groups so that they do have a voice. In situations where there are authoritarian governments, they are the so-called voice of the people on the ground who otherwise wouldn't necessarily be able to voice their grievances, in the international realm, that is. So I think, yeah, they have a role to play in linking the grassroots local context with the international advocacy or transnational context as well. One of my expectations is just to have cross-fertilization conversations with people who are doing a lot of the advocacy, activist, practitioner work on the ground, but also possibly interfacing with governments to tell them why it's important to have policy-based or evidence-based policies and not policy-based evidence. Because I think a lot of the data already points to the fact that migrants are agents of their own making, but they also have vulnerability and protection issues that need to be addressed by host land governments as well as homeland governments. And if those host land governments are not having conversations with the homeland governments, it leaves my diaspora specifically in a very precarious position to be in. I'm also interested in bringing issues around race into the conversation. There are certain migrants who are racialized, and they face particularly racist policies and practices by virtue of their phenotypic makeup, right? And they're very conspicuous in that way. So for instance, a white economic migrant who moves from Europe to parts of the so-called global south will not experience the same kinds of discrimination as a refugee or black refugee who goes from the so-called global south to the so-called global north. I'm a black African woman, and I would experience migration or development in different ways from someone who is not black or African. So I think for me that would be one of the major takeaways is let's bring race into the conversation because it exists. We can't wish it away, to see how we make race a cross-cutting issue in the same way that we do gender and class and ethnicity and all of these other social qualifiers. I think one of the major priorities I see coming from my own research on citizenship is documentation. So giving migrants the opportunity to have documents so that they can travel either across borders or even within their countries. So undocumented migrants, I would say, are a particular group that we need to think about and look at. Irregular migrants who move from one migration group to another, so mixed migration. There are many migrants who are documented, but because of the constantly shifting migration rules or immigration rules, they become undocumented, they become irregular, not through their own making or through their own fault, but just because the legal regimes are constantly changing. What I hope to gain from the Global Forum on Migration and Development this year, and what I hope that we all can gain, is that we move beyond the conversations, because I think a lot of really important conversations are being had at the policy level, political level, as well as at the social level among civil society groups. But how do we turn that conversation into concrete actions? A lot of these global compacts are non-binding, right? They don't require that states implement. So how do we make them a bit more binding in terms of domesticating them or taking them back to our governments and our constituencies so that they can advocate for migrant rights and working with migrants, right? Migrants are agents of their own making. They're not victims